begin. I think does it tell you?
Yes, and it says it's recording.
Okay, good. It's always weird to segue into suddenly you're recording and everyone can sort of hear you.
Well, I can do the, all the weird hand gestures that you told me not to make, that are symbolic of this, of my very dark allegiances. Do you get this sort of thing where like
where people like interpret random things you do as associations with some?
Yeah. It's like he wore a blue shirt on April 19th. You know what that means? It's like, I have no idea what that means.
I've had a few relatively recently, but not too many. But I know what you mean though. It's just sometimes you think, am I doing some small thing that's making some random person think that I must for certain be a member of this underground cult or something?
Yeah, the answer is yes, you are.
I'm a member of all.
It's just impossible to know what it is that you're doing.
So this is Dr. Jackson Crawford, who many people who watch this will already know from his own YouTube channel, which is a fantastic channel dealing with topics in Old Norse mythology and literature. And I'll put obviously a link to his channel in the description. And if you haven't, in the unlikely event that you've seen these videos and haven't seen his, then I'd absolutely recommend them. And today we're going to start off, I think, by talking about colour terms. So one thing that you've put a lot of work into particularly is colour terms in Old Norse. I think from when you were doing your PhD, possibly earlier, if I'm not wrong. You'll obviously be able to explain the idea of colour terms a lot better than I can, but it's a good example of a situation where different languages sort of taxonomize and categorize aspects of the world differently. So a lot of people will know the sort of fun fact about Russian having two words for blue, basic colour terms for blue, where English only has one that encompasses both of them. I'm sure the reality is probably more complicated than that. So when you're learning an ancient language or trying to read or translate a text in an ancient language, it's useful to have a kind of framework for understanding the colour system of the language. And I think you've done more than one video on colour terms. You did one on blå, which I think you were arguing that it probably means something closer to blue, whereas it's sometimes interpreted as black.
Yeah, that's such a vexed thing in Old Norse. Well, what's happened there, and first of all, by the way, Simon, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Thank you.
One thing that I think comes up a lot, not just with color, but with so many things in Old Norse and Old English, is that anything that has that sort of cool actually factor ends up sticking in people's minds. And so somehow this notion that Old Norse didn't have a word for blue has become one of those actually things that just sticks in people's minds and is just remarkably persistent, in spite of, I think, there not really being much evidence for it. In fact, I think a lot of evidence to the contrary that Old Norse did have a robust blue category. Yeah, so if I can set up kind of a sense of how some of this works with investigations in color more broadly, what I'm interested in is semantic taxonomy, right? So there's a taxonomy of animals, you've chordates and animals and mammals, and that breaks down to carnivores or primates or something. And in the same way, languages will classify things. So different languages will consider different things a fish, right? In some languages, you have a word that means just any aquatic animal. In technical English, a fish is a sort of zoological term, right? We mean a gill-breathing vertebrate, more or less, with fins. But in colloquial English, the term fish might include a whale. It might include maybe an amoeba or something, right? Your category, your semantic taxonomy for fish might include just any animal that lives in the water. So colors are a really interesting example of this, because as far as we can tell, human beings have the same ability to perceive color, barring certain medical conditions like color blindness and obviously blindness. So barring that, people, no matter what language they speak, can say this thing is a different color from this thing, or this is a different shade of a color from this thing, and we'll all see the same differences. The question is, how do we categorize those colors, right? What categories do those differences go into? So some languages have as few as 3 categories. That's, again, not to say that they perceive fewer colors, but they categorize them into 3 categories only. Most scholars say that English has 11. Probably, I would say individual speakers vary, and that you end up with individual speakers who categorize colors in English into 9 to 12. But what we're looking for are the basic color terms, right? The ones that any other color term can be reduced to. So we're not talking about fuchsia. We're not talking about crimson, right? Because crimson is a shade of red. It's colors that are not considered to be shades of some other color. So you find languages that have as few as 3. Usually those are focused on black, white, and red. So that a language with just black, white, and red, for example, blue would usually be considered a kind of black, yellow would be considered a kind of red, that sort of thing. But they may well have finer distinctions among those shades. They just don't have any categories that just everything breaks down to those top 3 categories. So what I got interested in is in 1969, Brent Berlin and Paul Kay published a book called Basic Color Terms, Their Universality and Evolution. And in this work, they proposed that all languages developed color terms sequentially and in more or less the same order. So this was a fairly controversial idea, the notion that, there's a stage 1 where languages have just a black and a white category and everything goes into one or the other. Now, by now, decades later, there's not really solid evidence, I would say, and some people would disagree, that there's actually languages that have just 2, right? There's well-documented languages with just 3, but just 2, I've never really seen good evidence for. So then they have black and white at the beginning, then they add red, then they add yellow or green, then they add the yellow or green they didn't have, and they add blue, and then they can start adding other colors. So over time, as they got more and more data from more and more languages, Paul Kay and associated scholars modified this sequence and decided that actually languages could add colors in more than one type of sequence, but there were still a few set sequences in which a language would acquire its basic color terms. And I was surprised when I began my dissertation research in 2010 that more or less this was taken for granted by a lot of people outside of that circle of scholars. And I thought that it would be neat to see if you could actually do a diachronic study of a language that was well documented over many centuries and see if it was in fact acquiring color terms in some order that they predicted that it would. Personally, I think that I incline towards skepticism about this sort of thing. Part of what made me skeptical about the notion of there being a sequence for languages acquiring color terms was just like, well, where does it start? When does it start? Right? Does it restart?
Right.
Because people have been speaking languages for a long, long time. So are you proposing that at some point, does this cycle? Do your color terms collapse and then you go back to 2 and then? Yeah, it's just weird to me that this notion of sequence, and there's also some pretty good evidence in studies of dialects of Italian that languages can lose color terms, sometimes in pretty unpredictable ways. Anyway, but this is what got me looking at what the basic color terms of Old Norse are. So as I mentioned, there's kind of this big meme out there that Old Norse didn't have a term for blue. One of my biggest findings was that, as far as I'm concerned, it definitely had a color term for blue. So there's a word blor, which is related to our word blue, and a word svartur, which means black, and it's related, English swarthy, German schwarz, etc. And so most translators over the last several decades have translated both of those words as black. So if you look up even very fine-grained translations into English from Old Norse, typically there will be no indication in the translation of whether the original said blor or svartur. They're both translated as black, which I think is a little irresponsible because they're making the distinction in the original. And I found, and of course, in all this research in the early 2010s, I read essentially everything you can find in Old Norse. And I wrote down every single time that any color term occurred, what it was describing, whether there were other color terms around it, and if it was in poetry, if it rhymed or alliterated, which might govern what term they used. I was pretty thorough. And I found that blor and svartur don't overlap. They're not used for the same things. And they're used very often contrastingly. In fact, in Old Norse, there's only 2 color terms ever used for human eyes, and they're blor and svartur, and they're contrasted.
Okay.
Right? Does he have blor eyes? No, he has svartur eyes. Right? So they don't both mean the same thing. Right? Because the contrast is meaningful. In fact, my main article about this that I published, it's in Norwegian in Norse Linguistisk Tidsskrift, the Norwegian linguistic journal, is called Blå og svarte augu, blue and black eyes, because I thought this was such a bombshell finding for the contrast between this.
It's very cool. One of your major articles is in Norwegian rather than English, but go on.
I guess my thought was that it would interest a Norwegian audience
a
lot, and I can write fluently in Norwegian, so I don't know, call it grad school arrogance or something.
No,
I don't know.
Not arrogance at all. It's just very cool. It's very cool.
It's fun. So anyway, the real reason, as far as I can tell, and this seems to be the stated reason, you'll find it in glossaries to translations from Old Norse pretty often, that people translate blor and svartur as black, is the simple reason that in Norse poetry, not in prose, in Norse poetry, ravens are consistently called blor, blue. However, look at a raven up close. They are, in fact, kind of shiny, and the shine that is blue. In fact, it's a lot like this very shirt that I'm wearing. Kind of black if there's not light on it, but if you get light on it, it has kind of a blue sheen. I don't know if I can show it with this lamp.
I think it's coming across.
Okay.
I can never like CGI in if it doesn't.
I also didn't, right, just have like glisten like raven feathers. I also didn't plan this, just like, oh, actually this shirt might be a pretty good example of it. So, I think that people have not considered that these Norse poets are actually just being very observant. And also they're not describing ravens as blue in prose. Again, it's a poetic description for the fact that they do in fact shine kind of blue. So I think that simple fact that ravens are called blue in poetry has misled us for a pretty long time and really gotten out there into the, if not the pop culture ideas about Norse, the intellectual culture ideas about Old Norse, that it just doesn't have a term for blue. I haven't necessarily persuaded a ton of people. I persuaded William Ian Miller, that's my biggest convert in the world of Norse translators. But I think it does make a pretty big difference when we're translating, because it's really notable that when men ride out to kill, right? You've got a saga, our hero, has someone to avenge, and he means to make that vengeance happen today. He's going to get up, he's going to have his breakfast, and he's going to put on some blue clothes.
Okay.
Now, if you say that those are black clothes, well, that seems to rhyme with our ideas today that black is a color of killing, and you have an assassin character in a movie, he'll probably wear black. But I think that it's something more interesting than that, because if in fact they're wearing blue, and I see a lot of reasons to think, again, that it is blue, then they're not signaling something like our Black Widow associations with the color black. it really seems like blue is a color that you wear to signal wealth and high status. It's a fairly expensive dye. And so it seems to me that you're sort of literally dressing to kill. You're making a very public act, right? Because, you know, that's a big cultural difference too, is that it is a worse murder if it's secret than if you confess it, right? If you confess it, maybe it's not even murder, maybe that's just illegal killing. But you're saying, you know, I have good reasons for what I'm doing. I want to be seen. I want to look my best when I go out and kill this guy. I'm literally dressed to kill. And I think that's a more interesting cultural fact than just saying, oh, you know, he's wearing the black of death.
Yeah, because black is foreboding.
Yeah, I think that's more interesting and more revelatory. And also, blue really is more of a death color for them. The fact that it's associated with ravens is part of that, but also corpses are generally considered blue.
Which they
that also. Go ahead.
Which they kind of are, if you.
Yeah, I mean, some of this brings up uncomfortable memories for sure. But yeah, no, I've seen dead bodies that are somewhat bluish or purplish. And of course, that comes to that comes to some of these questions about categorization. Because although I do find that Old Norse has a category for blue, it doesn't have some other categories. So, for example, purple, there's no purple category. So anything that's purple is included in blue. And so you get flowers that we would call purple that are described as blue in Old Norse. This is another reason to think that it's not black, because it's definitely not black. And so presumably also, and bruises are invariably described as blue. Dead flesh can also look somewhat like bruised flesh. So this all sort of falls into, generally blue seems to be basically a cool color. It's focused on blue. Its basic meaning is blue, but it can embrace other cool colors other than green, which is its own category.
Okay.
So that's how they're dividing up the cool side of the spectrum. What's interesting to me that I had never seen anyone else deal with is that the red side of the spectrum, the warm side of the spectrum, is very unusually dealt with from our perspective. So here I go in expecting, you know, when I was first investigating this, before I spent years reading everything and writing down every color term in Old Norse, I assumed that I was going to find answers that would support basically the default consensus. Okay. Blue and black are the same thing, and then you're just going to have, you know, a generic red, yellow, black, white, gray, etc. But it's quite different for that, because I found they did have blue and they didn't have yellow. There is no.
Sorry, I won't jump ahead.
I couldn't hear you. We overlapped.
Oh, sorry. I think I just realized where you were heading towards, and I had a moment of that.
No, it's good. There's still that lag. So they have no consistent term for yellow. There's a term for blonde hair, but that can't be used outside of hair, or it never is used outside of hair.
Okay.
There's no term for just a yellow thing, right? And this is something we find in languages all around the world, where you have a particular color that's not considered one of the basic categories, but a color term that has a very limited use to a particular field. So we have a lot of this with human hair, right? We don't say that stuff is blonde. Can you hear me?
I can. Sorry about that. I think that was my internet.
That's okay. Are we flowing again?
We are. We're good.
Okay. So we also do this with horsehair colors, right? Bay, chestnut, roan. Those are things we only use about horses. So those aren't basic color terms. They're too limited in scope. So blonde is the same way, and the equivalent to blonde in Old Norse is guler. It's only used for hair. Now, in the modern Scandinavian languages, that has become the basic term for yellow, and anything can be gul, right? You can have a gul car, yeah. But that's not the case in Old Norse. So the broader category of red actually includes all the other warm colors. So anything that's yellow or orange from our perspective can be just called red in Old Norse. We see this most prominently with gold. Gold is red gold. And in fact, gold being called red seems to indicate its purity, because when it's called blaked gul, I'll come back to the term blake or blaked, but it's more or less pale gold, that there's something wrong with it. Red gold is good gold. So, and their gold, you know, from archaeological finds, it doesn't look redder than gold that we know today. It's just that it's in that yellow category, which is actually part of the larger red category. Again, not that they can't see yellow, but they consider yellow a kind of red. The sun is also red, and they don't talk about the white and the yolk or yellow of an egg. It's the white and the red of an egg.
Okay.
So there's no yellow category at the highest level, or orange for that matter. But what I find emerging in Old Norse that it's very difficult to find good parallels to in living languages. The closest parallels I found to this have been in some plains languages, some American Indian languages in the Great Plains, but no exact parallels. Is that you have this red term that can embrace any warm color, but fundamentally means red, right? If you say it without any kind of qualification, you're going to picture the color of blood.
Okay.
But if you want to emphasize that it's a warm color, but it's not that kind of red, that kind of rich blood red, there is a new term emerging, bleker, which is related to English bleach distantly. But that means warm color, but not blood red. And so out of that, which I think is actually a top level category almost in Old Norse, it's certainly by the end of the Old Norse period, this become a top level category. Out of that is going to emerge in the later modern Scandinavian languages, yellow, orange, and pink. And what's kind of curious is that in modern Icelandic, blekur, the same term, means pink by default, but it still means bay when you're talking about a horse.
Okay.
So it's still, so the term is still maintained some of the ambiguity it had in Old, or not ambiguity, but some of the wider range it had in Old Norse. It's just become particularized in reference to horses with the old meaning of yellow. But I think it meant, again, in Old Norse, I think it meant yellow, pink, or orange. All it means is that it's a warm color, but it's not blood red. And that's something really, really different and unexpected. I didn't think I was going to find something that weird about the way they recognize color.
Yeah, it must be kind of a daunting task to go in thinking, I'm going to do all this huge amount of work and I'm probably just going to find what everyone else already thought. But I was going to say about when you use the term default, is that kind of, is there any sense in which if you said red, or rauður, I think is the Old Norse term, if I'm not wrong, if you said that to an Old Norse speaker, they would, is there any sense in which you could kind of determine that they would be more likely to think of blood red than gold red, for example, that blood red is kind of the central point of that, if you see, or is it just like that the term covers both and they're just both considered the same and your mind could go anywhere with it?
Well, a couple thoughts about that. One is there's what I call the best example phenomenon. And this is where a language has a common expression as color term as referent.
Oh, okay.
So English has white as snow, black as coal, red as blood, right? We have some pretty ingrained, very frequently occurring expressions like that, which show us what the focal point of that color term is.
Okay.
Because every language, this is actually a pretty universal thing that's cropped up from Kay's research, is no matter how big a category is, no matter how much of the color wheel it covers, it has a focal point.
Okay.
So when you mention the color term, by default, there's a best example for that color. So for English, again, red, be blood, white as snow, black as coal, or pitch, right? Things like that.
Yeah.
So Old Norse does this too. And of course, it's the same thing for red. It's red as blood, right? That is the central focal point for that color term.
Okay.
So by default, when you say red, that's what you mean. In the same way, if I tell you I have a red truck, you're picturing, fire engine red. You're not picturing, like a kind of off red toward pink or something like that.
Yeah.
And then another thing I'd point out that's a little bit revelatory about the kind of literature that survives in Old Norse is if you make a pie chart of, and I have, I can send you this because it's kind of funny. Make a pie chart of all the color terms that occur in Old Norse and how often they occur. Red is like half of the color wheel.
Right. Okay.
Talk about red more than anything because people bleed a lot.
I couldn't think of a single thing in English that encompasses that wider range of color mentions.
Oh, there is not. Well, so actually, when I was doing this, I decided that I would go through, and this was easier because I could use a search function. I went through the corpus of Robinson Jeffers poetry. And the reason I used Robinson Jeffers is because I like him, but also because the content of his poetry is sort of saga-like. He's talking about violent people in a rural setting.
Mm.
So I thought, okay, there may be a similar balance of color terms, but there's nowhere near as much mention of red, nowhere near as much mention of blue. It's a much more mixed pie chart, right? You don't have the huge predominance of one or the other. And of course, this is possibly, and I think even likely, just a figment of the literature that survives. The stuff that got handed down is these wild sagas. So of course, there's a lot of fighting.
Yeah, yeah.
But that's why I would say, yeah, the focal point, to get back to what you were asking, of rather is blood red. Okay. But then it has this wider extension. It's the same way that our red has a focal point in, blood red, firehouse red. But then, you could also say that, somebody's hair is red, even though it's not exactly that kind of red. But that's not your default picture for red, right?
That's true. That's true. Like there are certain things that I suppose retain this might be a really rubbish analysis, but it seems like there might be certain things in English that retain a kind of pre-orange sense of red. So like a robin's chest, which I would say is, at least in the UK, probably more, I would describe it as orange if I were describing it by default, and red hair, as you say, which I would say was orange, but of course orange was not a color term in the
that's a great example. The robin is an excellent example. Yeah, or red hair. Yeah. Right. And we still see this a lot in the way that if color is used to classify rather than to describe, usually speakers will reach for a more basic term. So we see this with wine, right? We talk about drinking white wine and red wine, not yellow wine and purple wine.
Yeah, yeah.
Right, which is because they're just more basic terms.
Yeah.
Or the description of people as white or black, it's not as if you're talking about paper white and ink black, right? But these classificatory uses of color tend toward more basic colors. Right. And that's probably also kind of what's going on with red hair, although you're probably right that that's more like just that it's a pre-orange, a pre-orange category, because orange is pretty late in most European languages. In fact, the word itself is ultimately borrowed from Sanskrit in the early modern period.
Yeah, I was thinking about the kind of recency of certain color terms. Like I think pink is not extremely recent, but in the last 500 years or so, I think is when it's become risen to basicness.
Well, and the K sequence has at the very end the last color terms language is supposed to develop in the sort of classic sequence, although now there's so many sequences, it's harder to say. But the last ones are supposed to come in are supposed to be brown, orange, pink.
Okay.
Which probably for English, and purple, which probably for English is about right.
That's right, yeah.
Orange, pink, and purple certainly are late. Brown, I would quibble with. There's, that word is actually quite old. And in fact, goes back at least to protoGermanic. All the Germanic languages share the same word for brown. And then you have a lot of animal names that are formed from that same root, like bear is from that same root. So I think brown is pretty old, but purple, pink, and orange are definitely late.
I get the sense that the Old English, oh, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, just one thing that people sometimes ask when I mention something like that, that I was trying to anticipate. but you probably have a better question than this, is, did the physical environment have something to do with this? Because there's lots of browns and grays in the natural world. There's not as many oranges and pinks and purples. That's certainly true, but what's interesting is if you look at languages spoken by communities that don't have a lot of contact with the wider world, right? If you look at perhaps very isolated languages in New Guinea, you'll find two communities right next to each other, right? Separated by a river or something, that have languages that on one side of the river have like 3 color terms and on the other side of the river have like 12.
Really?
Their physical environment is the same, but their languages have different classifications, right? Again, not that they're perceiving fewer colors, but that they just lump more colors into fewer categories.
Yeah.
So it doesn't seem to have much to do with physical environment at all.
I was gonna say on the subject of, I've got several questions that I'm trying to work out the order to, just because it's something you've said recently. I was going to say on the subject of brown, I think Old English had a few terms like dun and maybe faulu, although you could argue that was kind of something else, which I think given in Bosworth Toller, brown is one of the things that's listed, but I think some people argue, I think this is one of the things Casson was saying. I'm not sure how controversial he is or whether he's like a mainstream person. But I think he was making the argument that these were part of a system of color terms in Old English that maybe favored brightness and luminescence over hue. I'm not sure if that's something you would agree with or have thought much about.
Well, that's something, I would say that's a whole genre almost of color research where people have tried to emphasize those different categories, right? So what I'm talking about when I talk about color is mostly hue, right? The difference between something that's blue and something that's red. You do see talk about brightness. My problem with brightness is what exactly does it mean, right? I mean, it's kind of a saturation question, right? How saturated is the color? If you're talking about moving those little dials in Photoshop or something.
Yeah, so that's what I remember.
Yeah, I mean, most languages have a way of talking about that, and perhaps in some languages there's some evidence for this than hue, so that in some languages you are more likely to describe something as shiny than to describe it as red, right? So a fire truck passes through the neighborhood and an English speaker says, oh, that's a red fire truck, but languages where you would more default to saying, oh, that's a bright fire truck. But it's more, to me, it seems to be, and this is, there's debate about these things, that seems to be more a distinction in emphasis. Those languages can still talk about hue.
Yeah.
It's just that they're more likely to talk about this sort of saturation question. Now, a lot of languages do have some sort of obsessiveness with reflectivity and light. You actually see this in Old Norse a fair amount. If somebody's wearing shiny stuff, you are going to hear a bit, right? And in fact, one of the ways that they very stereotypically talk about the beauty of women is to describe them as literally bright.
Okay.
Right. Like if you read For Skirness or Skirness Mall, where Freyr is panting for the Jotun woman, she's described as so bright that her legs and arms shine. And this is a really stereotyped thing in the sagas and the myths, where beauty is sort of figuratively described as bright. And one of the words, and in the constellation of words they use for that, are some words that are color terms or color adjacent. One of them is white. So in fact, something that is not at all the hue white can be called, quote unquote, white, hvítur, because it has a secondary meaning of just really reflective.
Okay. And
in fact, it has a secondary meaning that's beautiful or handsome. So I think, and people disagree about this, but I think, for example, when Heimdallr is called the whitest of gods, Hvítastur Osa, that what that means is he's the handsomest.
Yeah. Is this
because that term is used so consistently to mean.
Sorry.
Sorry.
I was going to say, do you think that's from the sense of like someone being pale skinned because they're not outdoors all day kind of thing? Or do you think that's too much of an extrapolation?
No, I think that's too much of an extrapolation because when men are pale, it's a bad thing. If women are pale, that's pretty okay because they're high status women who don't have to do work outside. But a man who's pale is probably a coward, right? So when they use a word like bleker, the word that I mentioned that means like warm color but not red, seeming to suggest kind of a pink in skin tone, that's bad because that's a man that doesn't spend his time getting ruddy outdoors. So I don't think that's what's going on. I think it's just that because it's bright and reflective, that it's more or less being analogized to something light bearing because it catches your eye, right?
Yeah.
I think it's like the expression I grew up with that she's as pretty as a tin roof on a summer day. It's not that a tin roof is attractive.
Yeah.
It's that it catches your eye.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's kind of more the analogy there with the brightness and beauty. That wandered down a path, but
no, I like the tin roof analogy. Is that like a dialectal? Is that a grandparent kind of thing, or is it just a?
Yeah, that's I have many many such kind of cornpone sayings I can pull out when necessary.
We were talking about the dialect of your grandparents and how it's influenced your dialect just before we started recording, which it's another one of those things that seems a weird thing to say because obviously I'm just talking to you and we were talking about that, but there's there's a virtual camera now, but yeah, I kind of wish we'd been recording that, but
well, and I do wish I wish I had samples to give you. They never wanted to be recorded. Right. I have no audio or video of them. And they were such heroes of mine. This is a completely different subject. They were such heroes of mine that I would probably sound exactly like them if there hadn't been any peer pressure.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Some of their features still came through, wow. But they had a very unique accent.
Have you heard it anywhere since?
Well, there's people that sound more like them, right? I do encounter people where I think, oh, you sound a little bit like my grandfather, but I've never found anybody that sounds exactly like them.
It's one of those things that's really, in my experience anyway, it's really hard to, there's a fair amount of recording of my grandfather who's still alive, but my grandmother, his wife, it occurred to me that, and she only died relatively recently, but not recently, but not within the last few years. And it occurred to me that I didn't have any recordings of her voice as far as I knew. And it's so, although I can imagine her talking and exactly how she spoke and everything, I couldn't drag a phonology out of it. Like if I was to try and analyze the phonology retroactively, I couldn't do that much, even though you can imagine this, I suppose the sensory experience of listening to them talk. I don't know if you have the same thing.
I know what you mean. I have, of course, tried, although not in IPA, I have tried to transcribe my grandfather's accent in my Cowboy Havamal, where I take Havamal, the poem of Odin's wisdom, and put it into my grandfather's voice. That is a sort of I dialect attempt to transcribe him. But there's a lot there that's lost, and the super segmentals are lost. So I have another friend who's a linguist who says that I have the weirdest super segmentals that he knows. Like you don't sound like any living person. I think, well, maybe maybe I have their super segmentals. I don't know. But that's stuff that's very, very hard to transcribe.
It is, yeah. Like, do you mean just like intonation kind of stuff, or
intonation, pace,
right?
And then there's all these little tiny things that separate our perceptions of accents, like where is your R?
Yeah, yeah.
you know, and of course I meet people who grew up in the same house that have different R's from each other.
Yeah. I didn't
So
realize,
that stuff.
I was going to say I didn't realize till really late on. Like I knew obviously that there's an alveolar approximant and that's different from the, you know, alveolar trills and stuff, but I didn't realize until quite late on how much variation there is within what sounds like an alveolar approximant. So I've got friends who pronounce it as a labiodental approximant, which is quite marked. And then you have, I think there's a decent difference between common US and common UK pronunciations of it, isn't there? Although obviously there's variation within the countries.
Yeah, it also seems like it's not something that's necessarily as regionally controlled.
Yeah.
It seems like almost there seems to be maybe some family affinity for these things, but you know, like I said, I meet people from the same house that have a different R from each other.
Yeah.
But it takes a lot to notice it. You know, you really have to be just focusing on that and not really anything else. And then, you know, you can say, for example, you can say, well, this diphthong is a monophthongized, and you can represent that in transcription, but then there's different monophthongs and different amounts of off glide, and that stuff is really, really hard to express without, you know, driving someone crazy with 30 extra symbols around your IPA letters.
That's the thing I've seen, like, I've heard it described as maximum shitpost IPA, just like that kind of IPA that's got like 15 diacritics around every single letter, and it's like it's the most obnoxious thing, but it's also, if you want to actually transcribe things so precisely that you can just roll it off, well, nobody can roll that off, but yeah, it's
I love it. Maximum shitpost IPA.
I think that's
I've definitely practiced some of that.
Yeah. What in a jocular sense, or just because you had to?
Both. You know, and then I was just one of those geeks who would take notes in class in IPA or in runes or something, just to, you know, keep people from looking at my papers because I get annoyed with that kind of thing. So I would practice that kind of thing just to see, like, how fine, how narrow can my transcription be?
Yeah,
it'd be pretty narrow.
pretty narrow. I wonder whether there's. I always wonder whether, like, because within a certain IPA vowel character, for example, you can say that it's higher than the typical IPA character or lower, but you can't necessarily specify by what degree. I suppose you could probably stack the things on top of each other, but I wonder at what point it becomes like the human, whatever module of the brain is used to differentiate these things, just can't distinguish that fine a difference.
Well, at some point, if you really get galaxy brain with this, you can combine your maximum shitpost IPA with musical transcription.
Oh, that's what to get the intonation kind of thing.
Yeah,
that's a good idea.
That's like I said, that's your galaxy brain maximum shitpost IPA.
Yeah.
So you've got the musical bars, and you've also got the super narrow IPA.
Yeah.
That might come about as close as you could get to take someone who's never heard someone else and make them sound like someone else.
Yeah, yeah, but you'd still have to get the timbre of the voice and stuff.
Well,
I don't know if there's any way. I suppose you just have to show them a spectrograph or something, and
with decibel readouts just for the exact volume. Yeah, you could get. Yeah, I'm not talking about maximum shitpost IPA. I'm talking about galactic maximum shitpost IPA. It will take a planet to contain my transcription of your sentence. That'd be fun.
Do that with just one conversation one day and just analyze every single tiny aspect of it.
Just take 2 hours.
Yeah, just dedicate a whole week to it or something. I forgot what the last color term thing. I think I've got some questions floating in my head. I think I was going to ask about Blaker. Would you say there's any kind of saturation element to that, do you think? Because I think when I used to imagine it, having watched one video where you talked about it a bit, I kind of imagined it being like a low saturation, there being that kind of element as well as
that
peripheral element.
I think that's correct. I think it's mostly hue. It's not, again, focal red, but I think saturation, probably at least by default, just because most of those off red warm colors that the Norse might ever encounter would be pretty low saturation. You know, we're talking about pale people, we're talking about dun horses, some flowers, although some of the flowers they describe as Blaker are actually pretty high saturation. So for example, dandelions are Blaker.
Right.
So that's a pretty high saturation yellow. So, you know, it may, I don't think saturation is the key feature, but I think that by default it's often there. Okay. There's also, by the way, there's a peripheral term for low saturation, but focal red. So there is a term for faint red, which is rjóður, which is often used for, that's a desirable. So if you're a man who spends his time outdoors in the proper way, that's a desirable term for your color, because it's like ruddy, right? You're not blood red, but you've got that kind of sunned reddish look. That's rjóður. So that is a low saturation red, which is distinct from Blaker. Those a rjóður man and a Blaker man are not the same thing.
Okay. I think I remember rjóður, which I find very unpronounced, from your video, but I didn't know quite how, like, I don't know, like how do you judge because presumably over the Old Norse period there were, in the same way as you said, some, from English speaker to English speaker, there'll be differences in how basic certain color terms are and whether they are basic color terms or not. Do you think the same applies kind of diachronically over Old Norse? Because I think you said Blaker maybe becomes a basic color term later on.
I think the main change that you witness in the Old Norse period, starting from, say, skaldic poetry, the earliest skaldic poetry we can date, so you're going to be in the 800s, 900s, to the Black Death, 1300s. I think most of what you're witnessing during that period is the reorganization of the warm color space. Okay. I think probably early on it's basically red. Then I think by your classical Old Norse, early 1200s, you've got this rather Blaker system that I'm talking about, which is what we see in the Sagas for the most part. And then I think by the 1300s, late-ish, probably you're transitioning toward where yellow is probably emerging more as a category, given that it's there in all of the modern Scandinavian languages with the same word. I do think that, yeah, late in the Old Norse period, that gular term for blonde hair is becoming something you can say about something else. But I tell you, there is nowhere in Old Norse that I've seen it for anything but human hair. So I don't think it's a basic color term. No. But I think that is the main diachronic shift you're seeing. And then, by the way, for people perhaps thinking about this in their own language, I think that the main differences in color term systems in different people's heads who speak English today revolve around pink. Because to me, I don't think pink is a basic color term for me. Okay. I think things that are pink are basically red to me, and I can use pink but I really think of pink as kind of red, and I don't think I'm the only person that thinks of it that way. So I'm not sure pink is basic for everybody. And then there's some evidence, and I think this is probably right, that for some people silver is its own basic color term, which brings up some saturation questions, because silver and gray are essentially a saturation difference. But that's probably right. I think there's people that wouldn't say silver and gray are the same color.
I hadn't even thought about silver, because I would say there were certain things that I would describe as silver that I probably would be reluctant to describe as gray. But yeah. I'm trying to analyze if that's how I actually think about it. I feel like it's one of those fuzzy areas where you don't.
It's fuzzy because I think there's so many reference that one or the other is limited to. So I think with metallic things, I think you'd be more likely to talk about a silver computer than a gray computer. Yeah. But then there's reference where they seem to have different meanings, like silver hair versus gray hair does have, a somewhat different meaning. Again, it's a saturation question, but is one a kind of the other? It probably depends on the speaker you're talking to. I think I'd say silver is a kind of gray, but I do think there's speakers that probably don't.
I would have said with the hair thing, I think I generally interpret that as maybe silver is a more euphemistic way of referring to grey hair. You know what I mean? But
I'm definitely going silver these days.
I don't. It's not visible on webcam, at least.
Oh, okay. I didn't even use the Zoom touch-up thing.
Yeah, we mentioned that before. I wonder if I can actually.
But my family gets senator hair, right? So we all go like gray right here. Yeah. It's like we age into power.
Yeah. I like the idea of like aging from a particular point on your head, and then it just first it takes the hair and then it kind of starts spreading to the skin, and then bits of your skin go saggy before other bits or something like that. It's a horrific image. Have you looked much at, or is it even possible to look much at color categorization in protoGermanic? Because that I realize something that's beyond the scope of. I'm not sure.
Well, I've thought about it because you know, especially when I was first sketching out my dissertation, I thought, how diachronic can I go? Right? Can I figure this out for Proto-Indo-European? And one problem that you get into is, and going all the way back to Proto-Indo-European is a better example of this, because proto-Germanic is actually not that hard to figure out in some ways. With Proto-Indo-European, you have so many different roots that give rise to the color terms in later languages. The one consistent one is red, right? So the root hreud becomes the word, or generates the word red in, as far as I can recall, all of the branches of Indo-European. So that Latin ruber, English red, I think it's Tocharian rotsar or something like that. These all go back to Indo-European root. But then, for example, with white, there's a lot of different roots. You know, Greek uses leuk, which is from the same root as English light, right? So often these words for brightness and then the white hue get conflated. Latin has the term, has a few terms, right? There's the one candid, there's the one in argentum. Then you've got English or Germanic white, then you have Slavic bell, like a beluga whale. So that's really confusing. Black is really confusing. You know, Greek, again, has the mel root. Latin has the in root. Most Germanic languages have the swart or svart word. Slavic has what, chern, something like none of these are related. Like the category is the same, but the term isn't. So it's really hard to say what these terms were in Proto-Indo-European, presumably. And you know, we always have to remember that Proto-Indo-European is an abstraction, right? Yes, we can reconstruct it with a high degree of confidence, but it's always possible that what we're reconstructing in, you know, the semantic system is pretty late and pretty Greek and Sanskrit-y.
Right.
Just because that's what our earliest good attestations are. So, you know, I think probably just by process of, just by Occam's razor, it's easy to assume that Proto-Indo-European had a red, and that the word was something like prelude, and it had a black and a white category. Beyond that, very, very, very hard to tell, because other color term roots in Indo-European end up meaning such different things in different branches. You know, you can have one root, I think gel is a root, and that becomes, that's the root in English yellow, it's the root in English gold. I'm pretty sure it's also the root in Greek glaucos, which can mean, like, from our perspective, like anything, right? Ancient Greek color terms are a whole other bizarre realm.
Yeah. There's that whole, I don't think this is even a color term thing, it's just a poetic thing, but there's the whole wine dark sea.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, and then what does chloros really mean? And what, yeah, ancient Greek is actually very, very difficult. With Proto-Germanic, though, you've got a very solid set of color terms that remain pretty stable for all the descendant languages. So you got red, something like raudas; black, something like swartas; white, something like huitas; green, something like gronias; brown, something like brunas; gray, there's actually a few gray words. Of course, English gray, Old Norse gror, German grau, go back to like grauwus. There's also a special term for the hoary head, right? Like the English word hoary, which is often used in Old Norse too, hor. So, certainly you can reconstruct what is that 6 terms that are almost certainly basic and proto-Germanic and probably have similar focal points to what they have in the later Germanic languages. Yellow is pretty hard. English yellow, German gelb are from the same root, but they're not the same formation. So what exactly is going on there is hard to say.
Yeah, I was thinking earlier about the differences between English and German, and I was thinking, obviously, if you're, say, a teenager learning a language at school or something, for simplicity's sake, you kind of learn the color terms as if like you do with any word, as if they map perfectly onto. But I always wondered whether there were subtle differences in the difference between English and German. Like, is blue the exact same thing as blau? Do they cover the exact same? Because even like, those high visibility jackets that like my sister thinks they're yellow and I think they're green, and she won't be shaken in her belief that they're yellow and I won't be shaken in my belief that they're green. So clearly, even interpersonally, there are like.
Oh, I think these interpersonal differences are sometimes a bigger deal than researchers in the subject care to mention. And this is part of why I'm really, really leery when you see these reports on the bizarre color system of some somewhat obscure language. And it's like, I spoke with an informant who told me about this. Well, an informant, there could be other things going on there.
Yeah.
One thing I'll mention about modern languages that's complicating is that so I was talking, like at the very beginning of this conversation, I mentioned the difference between semantic taxonomy and actual biological taxonomy, right? What biologists call a fish might be different from what you colloquially call a fish. But our very scientific or scientistic culture tends to privilege scientific descriptions of things, and that can distort people's own perceptions of their own language, right? So I don't know how many times, because during my dissertation research, I was also doing some work with modern Icelandic, Faroese, and Norwegian, trying to see if there's anything unusual there, which I'll come back to in a minute. But I would ask people, so okay, once I would explain to them what I was trying to do, figure out their basic color terms, I would very often get this thing about, well, it's red, yellow, and blue, or red, blue, or green. It would be something derived from optics or from painting or something like that.
Right.
And because people have these very conscious ideas about how color is organized, which isn't necessarily how their language is categorizing it.
Yeah.
But what I found in the languages of today is that any color term that you have in, English, French, German, they have some equivalent to. And part of that is just mass-produced stuff, right? The same paint is more or less getting sold everywhere now. Yeah. So, every language produces some equivalent term for the color terms in the big languages of commerce. And so Icelandic has only fairly recently added a lot of terms that are basic in English and have been basic for a few hundred years, but have probably only been basic in Icelandic for like 100 years.
Right.
Like purple in Icelandic is a very recent coinage. It's fjólubláur. So fjóla, which is the violet flower, and then blár blue. So it's blue like a violet. That's purple. Or orange is appelsínu gulur. So appelsína is orange juice. Gulur is yellow. So it's yellow like orange juice. So you can see these terms are formed out of the categories they used to be part of. right? So purple used to be part of blue, so it's still called violet the flower blue. Orange used to be in yellow, so it's orange juice, or orange the fruit, yellow.
Yeah.
So you can see these are recent coinages, but for a speaker our age, of course I'm flattering myself, you're like 10 years younger than me, right? But a speaker younger than 50 is the Fuel Blau or Opposite Guler isn't a form of Blau or Guler anymore. They're definitely their own basic terms. So that mass-produced stuff and the scientific description of the world has definitely changed the way people think about these things.
I was going to say, aside from pointing out I'm actually 52 years of age, I was going to say, what was I going to say? It's about one of the big controversies surrounding Piraha, the most controversial language in the world, is the idea that it doesn't have basic color terms and instead it just uses kind of expressions like that, like leaf green or leaf colored, or I don't know, tree colored or something like that. But I wonder if those
it's still a color,
yeah,
right? I mean, you're still talking about color. You're still describing hue. I don't care if it's an adjective,
yeah,
right? Arapaho does not have. Someone's going to call me out on this for some technical reason or another, but in a nutshell, Arapaho doesn't have adjectives. It has verbs with adjectival meaning, right? So there's a verb, is red, right?
Oh, okay.
So yeah, so you can say like the truck is red. You can't say the red truck, but you can say the truck that is red, right? So like that, but so yeah, maybe in some sense it doesn't have colored terms if you restrict it to adjectives, but if you can talk about hue, like then you still have the semantic category of hue.
I suppose it's, I'm thinking with Piraha, the thing I immediately realized when I said it was that maybe the point is that they don't consistently use the same, they don't always say leaf green, they might just say grass green or something. They don't always use the same terms, although I don't know enough about it to know whether that's true or not. I just realized all the things that people could point out that were wrong. But
to me, I guess what I'm saying is, I think that's really, it's intriguing, but it's not, again, it's not that they don't have hue. Maybe they don't have, maybe the most intriguing part of that is it sounds like there's not consistent descriptions of hue, so that you wouldn't always call the same thing the same color. That's pretty interesting, but it doesn't sound like there isn't hue.
Yeah, okay.
That's my attempt at a hot take, but I don't know the details.
No, I don't know. Case. I don't want to pretend that I know the details well. But yeah, so I was going to try and segue at some point. I feel like we've got so much traction out of color terms and we could get a load more out of it. I was going to try and segue into the, sorry.
Yeah, we can segue however you like. I was going to say if that may be too much color for some people.
No, I mean, I'm really enjoying it. I don't know whether we could just go impromptu about color terms, or we could segue into the broader idea of semantic taxonomy and how that presents problems in kind of translation in areas that are not color term related, so abstract concepts and stuff like that. Because even something as simple as, like, I think the example somebody once gave me was even something as ostensibly simple as like a rock or a pebble or something. The terms rock, pebble, boulder, stone all mean related things, but some of them are mutually exclusive, like something can't be a pebble and a boulder. And if I held up a pebble, obviously all languages would have a word to describe what I'm holding up, but the parameters of what that word describes might be different from language to language. So in English, I think pebble describes something that's relatively small, probably relatively rounded, whereas in another language, the roundedness might not be as salient as something else. But if even something that supposedly straightforward can kind of present problems. Abstract concepts must be kind of hell when you're trying to translate things.
Well, I think your stone example is excellent, and it's a great example of why Google Translate doesn't work as well as people want it to. You know, yeah, that's an excellent example, right? Because all those things are rocks, I guess, or stones, but then you can't translate each one of them with rock or stone without losing something in English.
Yeah.
But you might take another language that has no such distinct word for little bitty rounded rock, right? Where that's just rock. And you might specify it as little bitty rounded, but those are going to be other words, right? So you put pebble into Google Translate and say, you know, move it to this other language, and it just gives you rock. So, you know, you're looking for a one-to-one correspondence, and yeah, the pebble is a rock, but you've lost the characteristics that make it a pebble and not just a rock.
Yeah.
If you want a one-for-one, you know, one word equals one word translation.
Yeah.
And I see that all the time with the way that people want to use Google Translate. And let me tell you, I could give you some Hall of Shame examples from, you know, TV shows and movies and stuff where people just like, well, just put in Google Translate. Like I can't even predict the problems that are going to come out of Google Translate because Google Translate is so literal minded about things. But yeah, abstract concepts are a great example of that too. You know, there was a time when I took translation requests. You know, this is a hugely evolving thing because, you know, when I'm first on the internet, you know, people who track me down 10 years ago and say, hey, can you translate this thing into Old Norse? Usually I just say, oh, sure, here it is. Eventually that gets to be enough where I'm charging for it. Then it gets to be where I'm only going to do this for Patreon. I'm only going to do this for Patreon sometimes. All right, I'm done with this. Right. It evolved over many years to where I was just overwhelmed by these things and nobody ever wants to pay for it. But one of the things that amazed me is people always want the stuff that was so modern in conception.
Yeah.
So modern English in conception translated into Old Norse. And there's just, you know, there's no natural way to say some of these things. And it's always hard for me to just spontaneously generate examples. But if I just, you know, look at translation requests, it's often stuff like abstract concepts. And it's not that the Norse don't have the ability to talk about abstract concepts. It's that they don't talk about them very often. It doesn't feel natural in the context of the way this language talks about stuff. So for example, you barely ever will see the word that corresponds to honesty, but you'll see talk about honest men and liars.
Right.
Right. The language talks about these things in concretes. You know, you look at Havamal, and you look, you know, stanza by stanza at this wisdom for living, and you don't see, you know, wisdom is, you see a wise man does.
Right.
Right. And it's very concrete examples. And so, you know, in English today, and it's not just in English, but because that's what most of these requests are in, we've become so abstracted, right? What a great example of this is in a lot of the Norse Reconstructionist pagan community, there's a lot of importance placed on what are called the 9 noble virtues.
Okay.
Which are these abstract 9 virtues, right? It's like loyalty and trust and courage and that kind of thing, that are kind of abstracted from Havamal and other Old Norse texts. And people always want to know what those are in Old Norse. And it's like, this is just an incredibly unnatural way to talk about this.
Yeah.
Old Norse.
Yeah.
It's, you know, the adjectives I could pretty well give you, but, you know, I'm trying to think of, it's still, even for my 2021 English, it's difficult for me to talk about some concepts, and this is one of them. But we are so abstract now. We talk about things in abstractions, right? I value loyalty. I want honesty.
Yeah. Yeah.
I like the beauty in the world. It's not that those things are impossible to say in Old Norse. They're just weird to say in Old Norse.
Yeah. Like nobody's saying.
I mean, the same way that it'd be weird if I told you, you know, have an orange day. Like, it's a meaningful sentence in English, but what does it mean?
Yeah.
like a meaningful, connected, like you can, like what am I saying? You know, or actually maybe an even better example, like just take words that have meanings in English, but just don't go together, you know, bike and orange day.
Like an orange day. I suppose bike can be a verb, can't it? So
Sure.
in that sense, it's a grammatical sentence. But
It's grammatical, but what is, yeah. So I think that so often we fail in considering um, not just questions of semantic taxonomy, but questions of contextual norms in different languages. And Old Norse is a language of, and I'm not trying to get all saber whorf here and say again, like, you know, they don't even know how to think about this.
yeah,
They do, but they take abstract things and they put them in concrete terms. And that's just not usually what we do. Now, when we do it, in a way, it's a loss to the rhetorical power of our language that we have become so abstract, because I think some of the best speakers in the history of English have been incredibly concrete speakers.
yeah,
Right. I think you look at a Martin Luther King, you look at an Abraham Lincoln, right? You look at people who really know how to speak to an audience in a concise, powerful way. They're
yeah.
often very concrete in their language. And I think we've lost some of that, not to wander completely down another subject, but I think that's just something that we forget in dealing with these older languages.
I think a lot of the best kind of adages that maybe, I don't know, regional adages or the kind of thing you might hear from old people are also put in very concrete terms and might convey abstract concepts and could easily be put into words that involve abstract concepts, but they're not. And I feel like that's, maybe it's just because they seem slightly foreign to us now, but I feel like that's what makes them so kind of effective.
Well, poetry is I think infinitely better the more concrete and particular it is. Right? You can say in a poem, you know, you can use the words life is fleeting, but that's pretty abstract. I mean, but you give me some kind of, you know, image about the tree that was young that's withering now or something like that. Like that's going to stick with me a lot more than just life is fleeting, you know.
Yeah.
You can take even really cliche things and make them seem more powerful by giving them some kind of concrete realization in simpler words.
Yeah.
But we don't do that very much in present day 2021 English. That's a somewhat lost art.
I suppose it's kind of a showing rather than telling thing as well, in some sense.
I think so. And I think also it's a little bit, I'm wandering afield here, but I think it has a little bit to do with how much we privilege science and scientific ways of talking about things. Is we want to sound smarter, and part of what seems smart to us is abstraction, even where abstraction really doesn't have a place.
Yeah.
Now, this is all ironic because a lot of what I'm talking about here is somewhat abstract. No, I'm a hypocrite.
It's like what you were saying about the way we kind of privilege scientific taxonomy over colloquial taxonomy. So the idea that in some sense, you know, people will tell you that technically such and such an animal isn't a fish, as if on some level it's not actually a fish because scientifically it doesn't fall into the clade of fish. Whereas, I mean, if everyone, my friends used to do this thing because we go to went to a school back then that had a lot of seagulls, and the seagulls would kind of come and eat the food when people had dropped it after lunch. And we had one friend who, whenever anybody called it a seagull, this isn't even a cladistic thing, they would just say, it's not a seagull because we're not near the sea, it's just a gull. And I'd be like, well, every bastard calls it a seagull, so it's a seagull, isn't it? Like,
I hate that stuff. You know, seagull is a great example. One that comes up a lot for me is the animals that I persistently call buffalo and antelope.
Right. Sorry about that. I've just sent you an email. I think my internet may have dropped out there. I paused the recording and it's all still alive, so that's good. I've unpaused it now. Sorry about that. You got to bison and antelope, and that's when I think my internet started being dodgy. But I can imagine you were going to say like,
yeah, it's just a constant frustration of mine because, you know, they're buffalo and antelope. That's what people have called them for generations and generations. There's no harm in calling it a freaking buffalo.
yeah,
Like no one's going to confuse it with a Cape buffalo. Why is this a problem? But people want to sound smart. And then I've seen this come up in grammar stuff too. One of my minority opinions about the future of English is not that whom will go extinct. That seems to be the majority opinion. I think whom might come back with a vengeance and replace who, because people don't understand the subject-object distinction between them anymore, and they get corrected from who to whom, so they start thinking whom is correct everywhere. I feel like every year I see more and more examples of whom used in place of who.
yeah.
And it's people of all educational levels, because even people who are very educated often don't understand the difference. And so, for example, I had an aunt, and I don't feel bad making fun of her. She was a moron. She used whom everywhere, and she would correct you, right? You would say, "Who's at the door?" And she would say, "Whom is at the door?" It would drive me nuts. like personally, I don't naturally say whom, right? I just say who for everything, and at least I have the excuse of, well, that's just natural English. You know, at least I don't sound like I'm trying to be pretentious. I know where to use whom, right? I know it's whom did you see, not who did you see, but who did you see is how I naturally say it. Anyway, that stuff drives me crazy. And I think that's actually a new major developer of language change. Now we're on
Hyper correction.
Yeah, I think we're on another avenue here, but I think it's an interesting question to pause on for a moment, is I think hypercorrection is getting more and more powerful as more and more people seek alternative means to convey high status, high intelligence, high education. And you know, this is one of the things people really compete about now, is trying to sound smarter. So I think, you know, stuff like whom replacing who is actually fairly plausible. I think hypercorrective pronunciations seem to be gaining ground in a lot of places. One of the most noticeable ones is often.
Yeah, rather than often.
Yeah. You know, who knows how soon people are going to start saying soften.
Whom knows? I said whom knows.
Whom knows? Yeah. I mean, but I don't think it's crazy to project that there's more hypercorrection in the future. It's become a big, you know, it's weird. I take a pretty big interest in just a wide range of things, and one thing that has intrigued me is it seems like human beings have such a desire to signal status, but in such a materially rich world, it's getting materially kind of harder to signal status, right? I mean, you know,
I see, because everyone can have nice clothes and everyone can.
Right. I mean, if you have a $100,000 car, it can do the same things a $20,000 car can probably.
Yeah.
Like, so it's sort of getting harder to signal that stuff with material things. So I think people start seeking, you know, other means to signal. And I think that sort of, you know, signaling smarter, quote unquote, languages is a pretty big part of that. And so I kind of stand outside of this a little bit because I fully understand how to signal that. And I fully choose not to. I just try to stalk as much as I can, which probably sounds weird too, but at least I talk like me and not like what I think is supposed to sound smart.
Yeah. I'm gonna pick up on something there in a second, but I was just gonna give like an example of a nice historical example of that is sort of in London throughout the 1800s. You have this hypercorrective thing where, like in Cockney dialect at the time, when people were still broadly literate, but less so than they are now, people would drop H's just because that was a regular sound change in that dialect or sociolect. And they would kind of hypercorrectively add H's to words because they knew that certain words were supposed to have H at the start. So they would end up saying like a apple instead of an apple, or
Right.
what's another example?
In the room,
In,
go to the auditorium.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, like, and you'd see this written in letters and stuff like that from the time. And then you have higher status people. I mean, even something like Punch magazine, which is fairly low brow, but you have that taking the mick out of people who do this, because it's, despite the fact that it's people attempting to sound high status, it ends up marking them out as low status. So I think there's one Punch cartoon that David Crystal had in one in a book he did on that kind of thing, which was I think it was like a servant girl or something like that, whose name was either Hannah or Anna, but in her dialect they were interchangeable because she dropped H's, and she would intermittently give her name as either Anna or Hannah, and nobody could work out what her name was, because, you know, because she was either hypercorrectively adding H or dropping H. But I was going to say, in terms of that, do you ever feel that, having been studying linguistics so long, affects the way you speak, because you notice certain features and subdue them or draw them out, or what do you think it's?
Maybe. I will append one more thing to our examples there of hypercorrection. One that I see a lot, again, that I think I see more of every year, is a writing example, which is people who don't understand the difference between just adding S and adding apostrophe S.
Right.
And I see more and more examples, I feel like, of apostrophe S for plural. And I think that's another one of those attempts at signaling education. Right. Anyway, just another example I want to throw in there. Yeah, with my language, you know, I think that's gone back and forth. There's a different answer now in what I would call my, you know, mature years or what have you. There was definitely a period when I was getting to know more about language in, say, high school, where I probably tended more toward a hypercorrective attitude. And for me, I mean, at least since I understood language, the hypercorrection was technically correct. But for me, it also probably favored more like hyper archaic. Like if I could say something in a slightly older way, I was going to do that. It was very unnatural, and it was just a phase I went through. And in a way, it influenced my more mature attitude toward these things, which is actually to be very watchful for very artificial language and try not to use it. This is a big part of my translation philosophy, is I don't want to draw your attention to my language in a translation, right? I want it to be naturally conveying content to you and not to draw your attention. So now that's actually most of where that consciousness goes to, is being very conscious of whether something sounds artificial or not. I'm probably better at that in writing than I am in speaking. You know, I hear all the time in millions of different contexts that I speak very strangely. And this usually, and I get such contradictory information about this. You know, people who say, "Oh, you have such a thick accent," and people who say, "You have no accent." It's like, I don't know which one is true. So yeah, I think most of it actually probably does just come down to consciously trying to avoid that kind of thing. What about you? Do you have a similar feeling or something different?
I think probably broadly similar. Like I think I used, like you say, I used to kind of, if I noticed something that was archaic that I could make naturally happen in my speech, then I kind of did it in a semi-unconscious but semi-conscious way. Like I didn't sit there and think, when could I use this in conversation? But I, you know, but now I tend towards I don't know, I feel like aspects of my speech have probably come from an interest in certain dialects, and if in a kind of group situation I can say something in a way that sounds archaic, in a way that's a bit funny, then I'll do that. But apart from that, I try not to too much. But I don't know how much that's kind of irreparably made me talk a bit differently, but I don't think I talk particularly strangely for the area I come from. I'm not sure, maybe I do. I don't know.
You sound pretty normal to me.
Yeah.
Another aspect of this, sort of psychologically, is as people fascinated by history, and we talked about this maybe a little bit before the recording started,
Exactly.
but I think both of us enjoy getting into the heads of other time periods.
That's true. Yeah.
For me, though, again, in contrast to a sort of archaizing phase that I went through when I was much younger, in my mature years, such as they are, that also has given me more interest in the present at the same time, because I can look back at the past and say, well, this is, and just love, a really immersive experience.
Yeah.
Past, like reading John Adams' diary or something. I mean, man, you get such a comprehensive view.
I'm gonna look that up afterwards.
Well, if you decide to read John Adams, the best place to start is McCullough's biography of him, because it draws on the diaries a lot. John Adams basically documented his entire life, and you can really get into the America and the France of around 1800, and it's fascinating. But at the same time, it makes me just that much more conscious of my own time.
Yeah.
And to realize that this is also a historical moment, and to dwell on some other historical moment isn't particularly useful. So I try to very fully inhabit my own time and be conscious of, of course, it's impossible to predict how the future will judge or participatory in. I think that
cut out for a few seconds just as he was saying the most interesting possible thing. He was saying like the future, we can't know how the future will judge us.
No, we can't know how the future will judge us, but I think we can sometimes anticipate what will be important to remember, or what will be something interesting to have been part of. So even though I am professionally very interested in the past, I'm also, if you will, professionally very interested in the present. And it's much like what you were talking about with documenting some of the unusual events that we're living through. I think that's a very valuable service that someone who's very historically informed is a great person to do, because of course you know what you would want to read about this time.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
In the future, right? Yeah. So I think that's a big part of what informs my outlook about some of the stuff now.
I think that aligns extremely closely with mine. I think that's partly why I'm trying to do this kind of documenting. I'll probably mention it in a video, this kind of time capsule to release in however many years, because it's kind of an awareness of the fact that I would love to have something like that, obviously from the Anglo-Saxon period. I'd love to have something like that even from the 60s or something. But the thing is, I'm not equipped to procure, I'm not equipped to produce that kind of thing in those time periods, but we are equipped to produce that kind of thing now, and people will be interested in this. The equivalents of us will be interested in this in, well, possibly even in 30 years time, but definitely in 60 years time. So it's, oh, sorry about that. I was just saying, we look back with such interest at the Anglo-Saxon period, the Viking Age, and we would obviously love to have something as comprehensive as someone's diary where they were completely honest and described everyday details, or a video recording or something of people just behaving normally.
Yep.
I'd even be interested to have that kind of thing from the 1960s or something, because I feel like even something so recent as that, we don't have much genuine, people don't know they're being recorded level kind of stuff.
I mean, I would love to have any of those things from any period in the past, really. And it doesn't even matter if it's a quote unquote boring time, because there would still be something interesting to see there about the past.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I guess another area in which I'm hypocritical is I haven't really produced anything like that, right? I don't keep a diary.
No, neither do I.
So maybe I ought to stop being such a hypocrite, but there's always other things that the time demands.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
My grandfather told me that was his greatest regret, was actually not keeping a diary.
Not recording.
Yeah, maybe I should take that more seriously, but I just never have. Every minute there's something else that needs done.
Yeah, needs done. That's an interesting.
That is another, yeah, I was about to say, I just realized maybe that's an accent thing. Yeah, we don't use the infinitive with needs.
Or once? Do you say once? Could you say once done as well?
That doesn't sound quite right.
Okay.
Because it's like the truck needs washed.
Yeah.
Right. It's sort of impersonal.
I see. Right.
Yeah.
But I've heard in Northern England, I've heard that like the car wants washing or something like that, but it's never combined with washed. But so
yeah, it's needs past participle.
So do you think it's a reduction of needs to be washed with the infinitive? Just
probably. It seems to me to be a Wyoming, northern Colorado thing. So it's hard to say exactly where that came from. I mean, that's not an area with a lot of, any particularly large section of, foreign settlers. Like sometimes in somewhere like Wisconsin or Minnesota, you think, is this a German influence thing?
Yeah, yeah.
And that something like that could be, but I don't know that there's like a large German community that would explain that. I think it's just, it's probably just a elision of the infinitive. But it's widespread around here.
Yeah. I feel like maybe some of these things are more archaic than we sort of give them credit for.
Oh, sure. And I mean, in the Scandinavian languages, starting with Old Norse and continuing to today, you drop the infinitive be if it can at all from context be inferred to be there.
Really?
Yeah, it's a very pro be drop set of language. So you see this with past participles like that a lot. Like, yeah, like that equivalent construction would be totally natural in Norwegian or Swedish, right? It needs washed. Like you would not say the to be.
It's interesting. I feel like there'll be someone in the comments that tries to drag those together. Like maybe it's old,
yes,
it's on Colorado.
Perhaps. I have also found it's I would say it's more of a Wyoming thing, but it stretches into northern Colorado too. Wyoming has its own, since it's such a small community, it has a lot of shibboleths, which lots of small communities have, and I always enjoy those little things. Like this river you think is pronounced like it's spelled, it is not pronounced anything like that. Right, that kind of stuff, like where you could never possibly know unless you would live there.
Is it like a result of? Is it generally a result of something like just mass vowel reduction in words in like place names and things like that?
Well, sometimes it's because the name is derived from a native language and spelled in some bizarre 19th century way that it's like a vague attempt at transcribing it, but the pronunciation is actually derived from the oral pronunciation, probably by the tribe. Right. The best example is there's a river. Okay, its name is spelled in 2 4-letter words, Popo Agie.
Hang on, I'm gonna write this down so I can visualize it.
Okay. Popo Agie.
You want me to try and work out?
What would you think?
I'm trying to think from a 19th century perspective.
Oh, I don't even know if there's anything that 19th century about it. But it's Crow. It's the Crow name for a river.
Popo Agie.
Okay, but it's pronounced Popoja.
Oh right, okay.
Yeah, or nothing like what you'd guess. But it's it's just one of those shibboleths. Every place is full of those.
Yeah, I've never heard that word before.
Shibboleth?
Oh, shibboleth, right. Yeah. I feel like that's the name of like one of those journal accumulation, what do you call them? Like a website where you get a journal off of, or like a way of logging into one of those websites or something like that. I assume that's not the original meaning.
No, it's from the Bible, because there's a scene in, I can't remember what book of the Old Testament, where some guardsmen intercept some spies, and the spies come from some different dialect area that doesn't affricate, or not affricate, but where S hasn't become sh and t hasn't become th.
Right.
So they say shibboleth. The spies say sibboleth, so they know they're spies.
Oh, I see. That's nice.
So shibboleth, it's a pronunciation that gives away your local origin.
Right.
Which, you know, we've wandered pretty far afield. I'll say this is another thing that I think is pretty funny about people and their attitudes toward accents, is there's certain things people are very conscious of that they'll try to reduce, and other things they will not think about that completely give them away.
It doesn't even cross their mind.
So, yeah, because Southern US speakers, you know, often realize pretty fast that the monophthongization of the vowel I gives them, you know, is a really obvious Southern feature, right? So they will diphthongize it. They will say, you know, mine, line, sign, but then they won't realize that they have, you know, they won't even think about things like the pin-pin merger. They won't think about the monophthongization of the oi diphthong.
What's that? Is
you
that?
know, there's all kinds of.
How would that be monophthong?
Well, I usually have that myself. It depends on the word, but the easiest word to hear it in is oil, which is O-I-L.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah. So the funniest way I've heard this described is it's the way people who make money off of it instead of lose money from it pronounce.
Marks you out as an oil baron.
It's heavily concentrated in Texas, but it monophthongizes to just, you know, the backwards C.
Oh, right. Right.
Yeah.
I always get confused between the backwards C and the. I think it's one of those consequences of certain IPA transcriptions not being very true to the phonetic realizations, is that I always thought that the backwards C was a lot higher than it was. I think.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I'm glad that's not just a me thing. But now I find, because I always used to like thought in my own accent, I think is probably more just O, but slightly lower than the typical IPA character than it is. But it's always transcribed backwards C.
Yeah, that's way higher than what I would hear from any American speaker. I have the cot merger, right? So I say thought.
Yeah.
Right. So to me, when I actually early on, this was a difficult thing for me in studying language, because I would see this is pronounced like SAW. What they're trying to get you to say is that backwards C. But to me, that's, you know, backwards. A, right?
Oh, I suppose forwards.
So,
yeah.
Yeah. So it's like, well, you know, so for example, you know, when I'm just this nerdy high school student, without the internet, you know, learning Latin and Greek, I see these little guides to pronunciation, and you know, that's always the example they use for short O. And so I thought it's, you know, it's anthropos, or, you know, it's there's no rounding it to me if you use that example.
Yeah.
The cot merger is really, really advanced now, way more than.
I was gonna say, like, my own, I'd probably find it fairly natural if I heard it, but I can't imagine what a US accent without it would sound like. Like, I can't imagine.
Well, New York accents usually don't have it.
Oh, like coffee.
Yeah, and in fact, yeah, so like that's a northern New Jersey thing where it's even kind of emphasized. It's even probably a little bit higher. But like a classic New York accent, people who still sound kind of New Yorker often don't have it. And then oddly enough, some Southern speakers still have the distinction pretty robustly.
Okay.
And then in the upper Midwest, Minnesota, Wisconsin, you still hear it fairly robustly. But like it is just gone for most of the West and the Midwest, it seems like.
Yeah, I always kind of wonder how in a long-term way languages kind of deal with that, because obviously every time you have a merger, a couple of even if it's just a couple of minimal pairs will presumably collapse into the same word. So
It's not many with that.
no, I suppose I have kind of,
Caught, right? How are you going to confuse those, right? You don't.
that's true, yeah.
One is a noun, one is a verb. I can't think of any minimal pairs that it really affects. Oh, actually, there may be one that it produces, because I say Lawayer. Okay, that comes out as lawyer.
Right. Oh, similar to somebody who lies.
Yeah, so if you also monophlongize I, which I sometimes do, depending on the environment, they can basically be a homophone with liar.
Yeah.
Which is kind of,
I mean, that's kind of, I mean, I suppose still contextually, like if you were to say,
well,
to a lawyer, if you said to a lawyer, you are a, why would you tell them they were a lawyer? You tell them they were a liar, but I don't know. I mean, obviously, there's the humor of.
I faced off with a liar in court, you know.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah.
I mean, hey, you know, liars can be very useful, but you know, certainly those jokes are not entirely unfounded in something.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to think if there's any examples I can think of with it's funny because I'm not, you're not aware of any mergers in, well, I'm not aware of any mergers in my own accent, but obviously there must be loads. Obviously the ones that apply everywhere, like the meat merger, which I'm sure there's somewhere it doesn't apply, but
is there? Yeah, I can't think anywhere that that's even a thing anymore. But that's meat beat, right? It's that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if there's anywhere that still has that distinction. There's probably like somewhere in Scotland.
I'm always conscious of saying there's nowhere, because there's always going to be someone who says, actually, I have the distinction. But I feel like I've got it in my head that Scots actually had the merge of possibly earlier than.
Do you say, how do you say POOR?
Or.
Okay, so you do have that. You have the poor
merger, yeah.
Yeah, so there are still speakers that say poor.
Right.
I have heard that. I've heard that in the US. My grandparents said poor. So that's not completely gone, although I would say it's probably on its way out.
Yeah. I know there's a horse distinction in parts of the Northwest and maybe parts of the US as well.
I've heard that, yeah, horse versus harse.
Yeah.
Almost, it's not quite harse. It's because I'm trying to do the rounded thing and it's hard for me. Horse, something like that. Yeah. You can sometimes hear that. There's a better example of that merger that's easier to hear. Crap, I'm trying to remember what the example is. I think it's stole, like something you wear, versus I stole it.
Oh, I stole.
Yeah, I think that's the same merger, but it's easier to hear before an L to me.
Right. Stole. I feel like there's, I know in like traditional RP, the O, the goat vowel, pretty much stayed a similar quality before dark L. So you'd say like something like stole, whereas in my dialect, I think it's allophonically backed. So I would say stole, which is as opposed to stole, which sounds quite weird to me. But I never know whether these things are worth transcribing. I suppose if you want to go the most, what's the word, parsimonious way, then just it'd just be allophonic, wouldn't it? So you wouldn't transcribe it phonemically.
But it depends on what your purpose is in transcribing, right? I mean,
yeah, that's true. Yeah.
If you are trying to make, the great compendium of Simon Roper English,
yeah.
You'd want to reflect those allophonic things.
Yeah, that's true.
And I mean, and you mentioned that your family has several different regional varieties within it.
Yeah.
And presumably when you're speaking with different members of the family, you probably sound a little bit different.
I think a little bit, yeah. I don't know how much that's to do with earlier kind of deliberate attempts to build rapport with them, because I think having a kind of standard southern southeastern English accent, it probably doesn't come across this way, but you don't want to come across like you're kind of conscious that older people who speak what were once considered less prestige dialects might see people who speak Southern Standard English as kind of in some way not in tune with them, kind of. And do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
so
absolutely.
I'm trying to assimilate in a way that, in an attempt to kind of break that down.
You know, this is part of, again, we were talking about the future of language change. You never really know what's coming in the future,
Yeah.
but I sometimes think that these ideas that there will be no dialects in the future are pretty mistaken. I think that the landscape will change. Maybe we talked about this in my crowdcast on my channel.
Like, we talked about your idea that what were once Southern features are now becoming
Yeah, because it's becoming such an identity thing that's different from regional identity. It's like a cultural identity, which can kind of come up anywhere. And, you know, I think about, I might have mentioned this in that crowdcast, but there was that famous survey of Texans. Did I tell you about this? Did I mention this, or do you know what I'm talking about? Where they were asked questions about their attitude toward Texas, but the survey was actually to get linguistic features. But of course, attitudes toward Texas heavily clustered with.
Oh, I see.
So you call somebody in Dallas and you say, like, no one has any clue they're being asked about their language, right?
Right.
So it's a survey like about Texas. You call somebody in Dallas and you say, "Do you love living in Texas?" And someone's like, "Hell yeah, I love living in Texas." They're going to have all these stereotypical features, right? They're going to have the monophthong. They're going to say y'all. It's, you know, all that stuff. But it's like, no, I do not enjoy living in Texas. They're going to have none of that, right? It's going to be like all diphthongs. They're not going to say y'all. So it's, to a certain extent, it's way beyond regional now. It's people are exposed to so many other accents that, in a sense, I think we probably somewhat consciously, but probably mostly subconsciously, choose to sound like the people that we want to identify with. And they may not be anywhere close to us anymore.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's, I feel like sorry.
How many kids do you know, and I mean teenagers-ish, in the UK trying to be cool, who sound a little more American than you would expect?
Lots. Yeah. Yeah.
And the same way here. The teenagers that want to sound smart often have, you know, like, because we have this media association that, you know, smart people sound British. Yeah. Like they will put on certain little British things, like they'll drop their R's or something like that. It's, you know, and it has nothing to do with where they are. It has everything to do with the associations of those accents in the media.
I think that's something I've definitely noticed, like, and possibly people who want to sound a bit clever here, trying to sound a bit more RP, even though that's not really something that anybody kind of, I suppose any way people speak is natural, but it's not something people naturally speak because they learned it from their parents anymore, very, very often. But, right. But definitely I hear teenagers kind of tapping T's and things like that, like butter instead of butter. And
I've definitely heard that from UK teenagers. Yeah, no, I'm very deliberately decided. Like, and it's funny because it's not as if, like, it's funny how media effective this stuff is, right? I mean, to this day in 2021, if you want, you know, your scientist character to be taken extra seriously and extra smart, you're going to put him in glasses and a lab coat, and he's going to speak with a British accent. And his name is probably going to be like Nigel.
Nigel. Well, I mean, likewise, if you want a really kind of stereotypically kind of rad character, they're going to be probably from a specific part of the US. They're going to be extremely attractive. When they smile, their teeth are going to you know, some white glint will come out of their teeth. And
right, they're probably from LA, I would guess.
yeah, yeah,
Like I can't imagine anywhere else that would have the same cachet.
yeah. I have a friend who's like, he was actually born in San Francisco, but was entirely raised in the UK. I think his parents might have been on holiday or like on a work visit or something like that. And he, up until this point, he's had a very standard Southeastern English kind of phonetic realizations. But recently he's got into the kind of 90s skater, you know, kind of thing. And he's started saying dude with a fronted goose vowel as like,
Oh no.
dude. And it's really weird watching it kind of drop into all the other words with the goose vowel. Do you know what I mean? Like
Yep.
they're slowly starting to take it. And it's really peculiar to watch that happen. Presumably just because he's got into the culture of it, and I don't know, but maybe
that's so California, that fronted.
it's one of the examples you use, isn't it? The serpent dude.
Well, because the classic example is you know, German U with diaresis, or it's French too, but not that many people know French or German, but people have heard, you know, people have heard surfers. So
yeah, well, it's a good example.
So it's always what I turn to. Dude, tune.
Rare to hear, for me anyway, it's so rare to hear like goose vowels that aren't in some way fronted around here. Although I can imagine it in the US, like goose.
Yeah, I mean, now that we're talking about it, I'm not sure that I know what I say naturally.
Yeah,
I think mine's pretty bad. Goose. Yeah. Now, one thing I still do. We've wandered far afield because now
that's right.
how I say it. One thing I do that I realize is a subtle, kind of a subtle archaism that I never realized was one until fairly late. Is I still have the on glide before you in a lot of words, and this is something I hear in a lot more UK speakers and fairly few US speakers anymore. So I say tune.
Oh, okay.
Right, which in some UK speakers is fully affricated, right? There's people who say like tune.
I think I say tune. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's, but it's, you know, it seems like the standard US thing now is tune. Yeah. But I say tune, dune, new, few, right? So I have all those on glides, and you know, I don't know if there's a regional variation of that. That just seems to be something that's just I must have gotten that from my grandparents.
Yeah.
I don't say supermarket though. That is supermarket.
Well, so I guess I say that as well. I say supermarket, but I say tune, whatever else. Yeah.
Huh. So it hasn't gone to supermarket.
No, it's not supermarket. I wonder why because I don't know. I know there was an example of like, I think it was his speech immediately after he became Prime Minister. Boris Johnson, who's the current Prime Minister, said the word dude in an attempt to be kind of funny or down with the kid. But he was conscious that it was like obviously gonna make him sound like an old man saying dude, but he said dude, which seems a really, I suppose it kind of makes sense as an extrapolation,
but I do say Dude Ranch.
What's dude? Is that a person's name or?
No, Dude Ranch is actually where the word dude comes from.
Oh, okay.
Actually, did you notice that? I said Dude Ranch is where dude comes from.
Yeah.
But a Dude Ranch is where it's like an experience vacation. It's a ranch that takes people as guests, and they get to sort of be pretend cowboys for a while, like you do like horse rides and maybe do a roundup and that kind of thing. So originally, actually, dude is a deprecatory term that's like, oh, you're just someone who, you know, traces the part. Right. So that's where it eventually becomes just, you know, companion or whatever. I guess now it's just guy.
Yeah.
But it's originally a deprecatory term from Dude Ranch.
That's very cool. I always wondered where it came from, or if there was like a deeper etymology to dude. that.
Well, I think the even deeper etymology is that it's a funny deformation of dud. It's a ranch where you put on the duds,
Oh, right, okay.
right? So you get dudded up. If somehow, probably just in humor, that becomes duded up.
Yeah.
With a long
You
U.
could imagine, you could imagine it being like taking the mick out of non, people not from that background who maybe mispronounced it because they'd only ever seen it written
Yeah,
or
maybe.
like that.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, but that's definitely where dude comes from. I was reading something about that because dude ranches have been kind of a big tourism thing for 100 years, probably more than that.
Do you feel like tourism in that kind of area kind of bothers you as someone with sort of Western heritage, or does it not?
I mean, if I have to be honest, by personal preference, I like some space. I don't like it when these places get crowded.
Yeah, yeah.
But I don't resent people wanting to see the natural beauty if they're respectful about it. I think my biggest problem is as I become an older and older man, and of course I started from a pretty old man's perspective. I've had a harder and harder time dealing with the way people just trash some of these places. And there's a cultural thing that I feel like started in California, although I blame a lot of things on Californians, where people don't pick up after their damn dogs.
Right.
And that has moved to Colorado, less to Wyoming, and that just really gets on my nerves. But no, if people are here to see the sights, I don't grudge them that, but I also don't like going places where there's, where I have to brush past people to see anything. That's not fun. Man, Yellowstone is like that.
Yeah, I've heard. I wouldn't have thought a place so big could get like that, but I suppose particular tourist points, I suppose.
If you stop on any road and walk a mile, it's not.
Right.
Right. Everybody drive. It's just the places you can drive to, but the places you can drive to are, it's like being in New York City in the summer.
Yeah. It's getting a bit like that here with lockdown lifting off, and but no.
Okay. Well, and I've been to London once.
You stayed. Was it Chichester you stayed in?
Oh yeah, I was in Chichester for a summer, so I spent a day in London, and of course I had to see the Tower, and that is not an uncrowded attraction.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever actually been there, having lived perhaps 40 minutes drive from it my whole life. But
this is how it goes. Isn't it? Like nobody sees stuff unless they're moving away. It's such a funny human thing.
Yeah. Why would you?
I mean,
you can always see it.
I had some friends who were moving away from here. They'd come here for grad school, spent a few years here, and they were moving away last week. And I said, well, is there anywhere you want to see for the last time before you go? And we talked about a few places, and just in the course of the conversation, I realized they had never really been anywhere. You've lived here for 2 years and you've just never seen anything, because it's always like, well, I could do it anytime. It's only when you're kind of pressed. Yeah. Oh, that's the curse of. It's I guess it's just the curse of the way our minds work.
Yeah, I think in the first year of university, when I was kind of friends with a few people from outside of the country, they obviously went because Preston is fairly central to a lot of big cities in the north. So they wanted to go to all these cities, which I would have thought, why the hell would anyone from this country go there if they didn't live there, let alone somebody from outside this country? But I went to more cities then than I think I've ever been otherwise. Just
that's how it goes.
I mean, you must have traveled around a fair bit. Do you tend to visit places or?
Yeah, I mean, like, one of the big cliches of our recent discourse is the difference between people who are anywheres and people who are somewheres.
Right.
And I'm a huge somewhere. I like the particularities of places, and I particularly love the Rockies. And so I'm actually someone who you know, there's worse things you can go through, but I suffered from being away from what feels like my anchor.
Yeah.
So, this is just legitimately, and I realize it's actually not something that's that common, but legitimately, I want to know the whole map. I want to, like, I haven't been there. I want to actually go see what that's like.
Yeah.
Now I combine that with, and I'm going to make a video when I get there.
Right.
But that's also something that a fair amount of my local friend group is into too. So I have a good friend who's actually been on my channel a little bit, Luke Gordon. He teaches at the University of New Mexico now, and the next state down. And he has had a lifetime project of going to every single county in the United States.
Really?
Yeah.
How's he doing so far?
He's at like 70%. It's not bad.
Jesus Christ.
And he doesn't just drive through it. He has to do something there.
Yeah.
So he has memories associated with all these places. I think it's great. I love that kind of thing. So, if I do visit somewhere, the thing is, it's sort of hard to yank me away from here. But if I do go somewhere, I want to experience it. I want to see the stuff. And I'm not wearing Bermuda shorts and a huge camera. Right. And also, in spite of stereotypes about me, I'm not necessarily in a Stetson if I'm somewhere without out, because that gets more attention than you need.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to kind of see things and get a feeling for a place, and especially understand the history of it. And I had a pretty good time. The most recent anywhere I've been was in late 2019. I spent a week in Montreal, which was pretty cool.
Yeah, that sounds great. Do you find it's extremely different from places in the northern US that you've been?
No, Montreal is French-speaking Chicago.
Right. Okay. I'm surprised to hear the Chicago connection. That's
what it reminded me of. I think it was just the architecture.
Right.
It felt Chicago-y to me. I'm sure it doesn't to somebody else, but I thought it seemed kind of Chicago-like. But yeah, it was very French, and I definitely stretched my fairly limited French.
Right. Had you learned French in the course of learning about Indo-European languages then?
Yeah, I just take an interest in any language, right? So, and of course, I've had to read books in French and stuff like that. So my French is academic at best.
Right.
But I tried. I always try to speak the local language if I'm somewhere else.
Yeah. 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 It's nice to attempt. I think I tried. Like, we're in Prague once, me and a couple of friends, and I needed a bag to take away some things in or something. And the only way I could think of to get a bag was to go to the local supermarket and get something and ask for it to come in a bag. So I kind of used Google Translate. I mean, I kind of listened to it a few times. I tried to think of it in terms of IPA, and I can't remember for the life of me what I said, and I've got no idea what it actually meant, but he understood and didn't seem to care that somebody clearly foreign was speaking his language. So
that's rewarding.
Yeah.
I think probably the best reward I ever got was when I was in Iceland, and I'm speaking Icelandic. I'm having some conversation, and somewhere in the back of my non-speaking mind, I start thinking, "What is receive?"
Right.
And I couldn't remember the Old Norse or Icelandic word for some reason, but I remembered that in Old English it's thijon.
Right.
And I thought, well, so that would come out as thigya, and I tried it and I said thigya, and it was actually the word. And like I did that by the power of linguistics.
Did you check in that it was real afterwards, or did it just seem to work?
No, it worked, and then I checked, like, yeah.
One of my Spanish friends did that occasionally. He'd just be in conversation and he'd just say a word. He'd just say a phrase, and then after I'd responded, he said, "Does it exist?" And I went, "What?" And he said, "This word, does it exist?" And I went, "Yes." And he went, "Okay, well, it's just."
Well, but it's pretty easy with Romance languages in English, where you just, all the complicated vocabulary is kind of the same.
Yeah, that's true.
Which is funny because people, there's like a TV trope where people trying to have a conversation in front of someone who only speaks Spanish or French will use really elaborate, technical sounding English, which is ironic because it's exactly the English that's the most understandable
They're going to understand.
speaker.
Yeah.
But yeah, I enjoy that stuff. And actually in Iceland, one thing that I would encounter is people who would like hear me speak, kind of blink and say, that was Icelandic.
As in like it sounds exactly like?
No, like they had actually never heard someone speak Icelandic with a foreign accent.
Oh, right. Oh, okay.
You know, in English, we get used to, you know,
People speak, yeah.
Yeah, you or I hear 85 accents a day.
Yeah.
But in Icelandic, there's like one accent, you know. So to hear a foreign accent was actually a surprise to people sometimes. And it would like once they realized it, that I was actually speaking Icelandic, like there's just something about my pronunciation, you know, and I'm sure there's several signals. It's like, oh, that is Icelandic. And then they can engage with me. But at first it's like, what?
What, just because they didn't clock that?
Well, it's not English.
It's not, yeah.
But it doesn't sound like Icelandic usually sounds. So
do you find that they do you find that they did the common non-native but very good English speaker thing of just switching to English, and you didn't get a chance to
depends
test out the Icelandic? Or
it depends. Not always, and it would depend on who you're dealing with. I mean, if you're just dealing with somebody to like buy something, yeah, they would usually just switch in, you know, they don't care. But there are a lot of people that would have a conversation with you and sometimes not even comment about it, which is the best thing. Because if I'm speaking Icelandic to you, I don't want to talk about Icelandic. I just want to talk about whatever we're talking about.
Yeah, yeah.
There was one guy who drove me crazy because I would go to his shop to buy books, and you know, I'm buying books in Icelandic, talking to him in Icelandic, and he just insists on talking to me in English.
Right.
At one point, I'm just exasperated with it. And I said, look, I'm buying books in Icelandic. I'm speaking to you in Icelandic. Why do you insist on talking to me in English? Yeah. And he said, so it's okay. You're Faroese. You'll get it right eventually.
Oh, what, like as in he thought you were Faroese? Yeah.
So I guess that's the only foreigner he could conceive of that would try to learn Icelandic. I don't know.
Yeah. I was going to say,
that was pretty funny.
The first thing that jumped to mind was that Faroese has R, but
yeah, right. Yeah, that could have been it.
Like you,
that could have been part of it, but I can trill pretty well.
I was going to say, I've always heard you like trill whenever you speak. Maybe I don't know. Maybe it was just like, why would anyone try and learn Icelandic except?
I think it might have been that. That was just one of the weirdest things that happened to me. Now in Norway, actually, I can usually just speak Norwegian with people, and it's not an issue. It never really comes up. But in terms of spoken language, I'm a more fluent Norwegian speaker than Icelandic speaker, right. So that might be part of it. But then in Sweden, so it's all different everywhere, it seems like, and I think it has a lot to do with the context in which people are meeting you. If it's just a transaction, they're definitely not going to try, or they're definitely not going to put up with you trying. If you're even the least bit unconfident sounding, but it just depends place to place.
There was a day when I was kind of stuck in Spain because I'd missed, because the flight was like over the day boundary. It was like over midnight. And there's like an hour difference between here and there. I'd missed the flight because I thought it was the following day. So I managed to get one for the following day at great expense, and was just stuck in Alicante for a day with nowhere to stay. So I kind of wandered around, you know, alternating between 3 Starbucks, charging my phone and their Starbucks ports, but their Starbucks ports, their phone ports. I kind of built up this, I knew a certain amount of Spanish, but certainly couldn't rattle it off fluently. So I kind of got used to what you say when you're buying a drink or something. I got used to the things that you say, like you give them your name because it's Starbucks and they write your name on the drink. You give them what you tell them what you want. You tell them how big you want it, and you such and such. And occasionally people would ask for it in an order I wasn't used to. And without thinking about it, I just say the wrong piece of information at the wrong time, and they kind of go in Spanish, well, that's not what I asked you, but okay. And then they just kind of
right. What do you want, Simon? Right. Yeah, no, of course. That kind of, well, we get into these formulas. I mean, how many times does someone say, how are you? And you say, I'm doing well, how are you? And they say, well, how are you? Right? It's just,
exactly.
we just get into these formulas. Well, it's been a really fun time talking with you about color and dialect and accent differences and all these other questions about language, but unfortunately, I have to get going pretty soon. So Simon, thank you very much for your time. Thank you to your whole audience for the time they spent with us, and wishing everybody all the best.
Yes, thank you very much indeed for, I realize the all the best is the trademark kind of sign off, but oh, you got it.
Oh, hold on, if you want me to really trademark this, all the best.